Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what I hope will be an important and informative hearing. This is a hearing on the science behind claims of global warming. Now, this is the Science Subcommittee of the Senate Commerce Committee, and we are hearing from distinguished scientists sharing their views, their interpretation, their analysis of the data and the evidence. Now, I am the son of two mathematicians, two computer programmers and scientists, and I believe that public policy should follow the actual science and the actual data and evidence, and not political and partisan claims that run contrary to the science and data and evidence. On November 28, 2013, an intrepid band of explorers set off from New Zealand on a research expedition to the Antarctic. Among their goals was investigating the impact of global warming on the Antarctic continent and islands. On Christmas Eve, they became stuck in ice. Ice that the climate industrial complex had assured us were vanishing. This expedition was there to document how the ice was vanishing in the Antarctic. But the ship became stuck. It had run into an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore might put it. 3 icebreakers tried and failed to reach the trapped ship because the ice was too thick. After a week of rescue attempts, the passengers were airlifted from the vessel. Here are the inconvenient facts about the polar ice caps. The Arctic is not ice-free. This year's minimum sea ice extent was well above the record low observed in 2011. In the Antarctic, a recent study from the Journal of Glaciology indicates that the ice is not only not decreasing, but is in fact increasing in mass, directly contrary to what the global warming alarmists had told us would be happening. This is not what their climate models projected. Yet these inconvenient facts never seem to get the attention of people like John Kerry. And indeed, I would note behind me, on August 31st, 2009, then Senator John Kerry said, quote, "Scientists project that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer of 2013. Not in 2050, but 4 years from now." Well, the summer of 2013 has come and gone. And John Kerry was not just a little bit, he was wildly, extraordinarily, entirely wrong. Had the Antarctic expedition, in the picture next to it, not believed the global warming alarmists, had they actually looked to the science and the evidence, they wouldn't have gone down and been surprised when they got stuck in ice. Facts matter, science matters, data matters. That's what this hearing is about. Data. According to the satellite data, there has been no significant global warming for the past 18 years. Those are the data. The global warming alarmists don't like these data. They are inconvenient to their narrative. But facts and evidence matters. And I would note that many in the media reflexively take the side of the global warming alarmists, reflexively oppose anyone who actually points out, well, was John Kerry's prediction accurate? No, it was stunningly and entirely false. Was the prediction of computer model after computer model that showed dramatic warming, were those predictions correct? No. The satellite data demonstrate no significant warming over 18 years. public policy should follow science and evidence and data. And I would note that I found it amusing that our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle, I discovered, held a press conference today as a prebuttal to this hearing. I suppose I should view that in a sense as a backhanded compliment. I'm reminded of the bard, methinks she doth protest too much. What does it say when members of the United States Senate are protesting? How dare the Science Subcommittee in the United States Senate hear testimony from scientists about actual science? How dare we focus on such topics? I think that is indeed exactly what we were elected to do. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd first like to thank the witnesses for being here today and for your testimony on what is surely a very important topic. When we think about global warming, there are risks and there are certainties. Let's talk first about the certainties. By burning fossil fuels, humans are releasing carbon into the atmosphere that would have otherwise remained locked away. This process creates carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, that traps heat that otherwise would have been radiated off into space. We know that by the law of conservation of energy, that additional heat can't just magically disappear. Instead, it causes our planet to get warmer. What else is certain? We've already seen the symptoms of a warming planet, not just in the temperature records, but in the rising sea and shrinking ice levels, in toxic algae blooms that are flourishing in the Great Lakes that were made worse by increased precipitation, runoff, and warmer water temperatures, tainting drinking water for 2.8 million people in recent years. All of that is certain. Now let's talk about the risk. Managing risk is all about looking at a range of possible outcomes and consequences, looking at the likelihood of each of those consequences, and then looking to see if there is anything you can do to reduce the likelihood of those consequences, or both. From our models and from our understanding of the science, we see a range of potential outcomes, a range of possible warming trends, a range of consequences based on those trends. There are implications for our national security, for the economic health of our country, for our food supply and agriculture, and for the health and safety of Michiganders, Americans, as well as people all around the planet. The possible consequences of all these areas range from the bad to the catastrophic. Given our best scientific judgment of our risk posture, of the consequences we face as a civilization and the likelihood of those consequences occurring, we must do what we can to mitigate these risks. We're going to hear today that there is some disagreement in the scientific community over the magnitude of that risk. As a matter of fact, I know we're going to hear from 3 scientists and a political commentator and blogger who disagree with varying aspects of the scientific consensus, as well as to argue that the science is not settled. Well, here we need to support our scientific community so that they can continue to answer the open questions and help policymakers make better understand the risks that we face. And we'll hear that scientists need to be protected from political interference from either side of the aisle. And I certainly agree that we need to support our scientific community and protect them from political influence. But I also know that while we continue to refine the science, we have to act on the risks and findings that our scientists have discovered. I would like to introduce into the record statements and letters from various science professional organizations representing tens of thousands of scientists, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Chemical Society, the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, the American Society for Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, the American Statistical Association, the Ecological Society of America, the American Institute of Biological Sciences, and the Geological Society of America. It is the position of these organizations and that the evidence is overwhelming that the Earth is warming, global warming is real, and that human activity is the primary contributor. I'd like unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter these statements into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. We know that there will always be more to learn. We will undoubtedly find more down the road, that there's more to discover about what we don't know. And that's really the beautiful thing about science. We always have more to learn. But knowing that there is more to learn should not stop us from acting on what we know now. We must discuss and determine what actions we need to take to limit the serious risk that we face. And there are many things that we can do that are not just good for the environment, but are good for the economy. Investments in clean energy create good-paying jobs and help us produce the energy we need right here in the United States. For example, Michigan is home to more than 220 wind and solar companies, representing tens of thousands of jobs. The growth in Michigan's clean energy sector can be attributed in part to the state's renewable electricity standard, which requires 10% of the state's energy to come from renewables. But there is a lot of room to grow. If industry sourced its parts from local manufacturers, renewable energy could support over 20,000 Michigan jobs in manufacturing alone by 2020. What's more, expanding Michigan's renewable electricity standard from 10% to over 30% by 2030 would generate more than $9 billion in new capital investments. Investments in research and science, including the understanding of our sun-Earth system, pay dividends for our country's future economic growth, our economic competitiveness, and our very way of life. China certainly understands that. So if we miss this opportunity to make these investments now, we may soon find ourselves falling behind in the global economy. So let's focus on innovating our way out of this problem, and let's take a big step forward as a country.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Nelson, the ranking member on the full committee, is requested to give an opening as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I make a couple of comments, I want to address a parliamentary inquiry. There's a sign out there on the witness table, Mr. Mayor, Aaron Mayer, president of the Sierra Club. Was Mr. Mayer extended a formal invitation by the chairman of this committee, Senator Thune?
He was invited by me, the chairman of this subcommittee, and he declined. And momentarily, I'm going to describe the circumstances behind that invitation and his decision not to attend.
Okay, I would just note that the protocol and the rules of the committee are such that invitations for all witnesses are extended by the chairman of the committee, and I would like the record to reflect that such an invitation by Senator Thune, our chairman, was not extended, and therefore there should be no place up there at the witness table, but that should be noted for the record. Now, Mr. Chairman, rather than get this started off in an adversarial way, you and I have had a very good relationship. We have worked together on the space program, and you and I have some significant differences about this issue. And so rather than it be contentious, I want it to be factual. First of all, I'd like to show a couple of pictures of what is happening in Miami Beach right now. Now, I had the privilege a couple of years ago when I was chairman of the Science and Space Subcommittee of taking our Commerce Committee to Miami Beach. And Miami Beach is basically ground zero in the United States for what we're seeing as a consequence of global warming, and that is sea level rise. We had a NASA scientist that testified at the hearing that over the last 40 years, measurements, these are measurements, not forecasts, not projections, they're measurements, that the seas have risen in South Florida from 5 to 8 inches. This photograph is a consequence at seasonal high tide of what's happening on the streets of Miami Beach. Now, interestingly, a couple of years earlier, the present mayor of Miami Beach, in running for mayor, did an actual campaign commercial in a kayak on Alton Road, which is on the opposite side of the barrier island, the west side of the barrier island. From this is not far from the actual ocean. This one as well, you can look down the street there and see the sky in the background. That's about a couple of blocks down toward the beach. The campaign commercial in a kayak was at the October seasonal high tide on Alton Road, which is on the opposite side of the barrier island. And the fact is that we're having to deal with this. Now, there's another consequence of this, and that is what you heard of saltwater intrusion. Saltwater is heavier than freshwater. Florida sits on a honeycomb of limestone that is filled with fresh water. That's where we get our fresh water, from the aquifer underneath. As the salt water rises in sea level rise, the greater pressure because of the heavier water is intruding into the interior, and we've had a number of municipal wells that are now too salty, and it's another consequence. So some of us representing our constituents have to deal with the realities of what we see. I might point out that when you talk about measurements, 1992, we launched a satellite called TOPEX. It had an altimeter. It takes precise measurements of the surface of the ocean, and its successor satellites, Jason 1 and Jason 2, have been collecting that data. And observation, not projections, the data tells us that the average global sea level is rising at about 3.2 millimeters a year since 1993. That's about 1/10 of an inch, or over a decade, an inch. So I'm glad that you were kind enough to let Senator Peters invite a minority witness, and we brought in Admiral David Titley, a lifelong public servant, a scientist, a decorated military officer from his naval career, and he's going to discuss this much more in detail. In addition to climate science, the Admiral is an expert in oceanography, tropical meteorology, weather risk, and how all of this will impact our national security. We need to understand how climate change is affecting all of the calculations that go into our national security by our national security teams. And after 32 years in the U.S. Navy, he now works at Pennsylvania State University. So I will conclude my remarks and insert the rest of them in the record with the chairman's permission.
Without objection. Thank you, Senator Nelson. Would now like to welcome each of our expert witnesses. Thank you for coming to testify to this panel. First witness is Dr. John Christie. Dr. John Christie is a distinguished professor of atmospheric science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville and is Alabama's state climatologist. He's been awarded NASA's Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement, was elected a Fellow of the American Meteorological Society, which also selected him for the special award for building climate data sets from satellites. and served as lead author of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Beginning as a teenager, Dr. Christie has studied climate for the past 50 years. Dr. Judith Curry currently serves as a professor and is former chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology, in addition to serving as president of Climate Forecast Applications Network. Dr. Curry received a PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Chicago. Dr. Curry has recently served on the NASA Advisory Council Earth Science Subcommittee, the DOE Biological and Environmental Research Advisory Committee, the National Academy's Climate Research Committee, and the Space Studies Board, and the NOAA Climate Working Group. Dr. Curry is a fellow of the American Meteorological Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Geophysical Union. Dr. William Happer currently serves as a Cyrus Fogg Brackett Professor of Physics at my alma mater, Princeton University, and has spent most of his professional life studying the interactions of visible and infrared radiation with gases, one of the main physical phenomena behind the greenhouse effect. Throughout his career, he has published over 200 papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals and is a member of a number of professional organizations, including the American Physical Society and the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Happer also served as the Director of Energy Research at the Department of Energy from 1990 to 1993, where he supervised all of DOE's work on climate change. Mr. Mark Stein is an international best-selling author, a top 5 jazz recording artist, and a leading Canadian human rights activist. Mr. Stein recently contributed to the #1 climatology bestseller, Climate Change, The Facts, and edited another #1 climatology bestseller, A Disgrace to the Profession, the world's scientists, in their own words, on Michael Mann, his hockey stick, and their damage to science, Volume 1. In his capacity as a human rights activist, Mr. Stein's human rights campaign to restore free speech to Canada led to the repeal by Parliament of the notorious Section 12 hate speech law, a battle he recounts in his books, Lights Out, Islam, Free Speech, and the Twilight of the West. And then Dr. David Titley, who Senator Nelson mentioned already. Dr. Titley currently serves as professor of practice in the Department of Meteorology at the Pennsylvania State University and is the founding director of Penn State's Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk. Dr. Titley holds a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology from the Pennsylvania State University. From the Naval Postgraduate School, he earned a Master's of Science in Meteorology and Physical Oceanography and a PhD in Meteorology. Prior to joining Penn State, Dr. Titley served as a naval officer for 32 years and rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. His career included duties as commander, Naval Meteorologist and Oceanography Command, Oceanographer and Navigator of the Navy, and Deputy Assistant Chief of Naval Operations for Information Dominance. He has also served as Senior Military Assistant for the Director, Net Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. While serving in the Pentagon, Dr. Titley initiated and led the U.S. Navy's task force on climate change. After retiring from the Navy, Dr. Titley served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Operations, the chief operating position at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. The final witness that we had hoped to have today is Mr. Aaron Mayer, the president of the Sierra Club. I would note, a number of weeks ago, Mr. Mayer was witness at another hearing that I chaired in the Oversight Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. This was a hearing concerning the effect of overregulation on minority communities, and in particular the devastating impacts of overregulation in the Obama administration on the Hispanic community and the African American community. There were a host of witnesses that testified to the job losses, to the stagnating wages as a consequence of overregulation from the federal government. Mr. Mayer was one of the witnesses, a minority witness invited by the Democrats. Mr. Mayor's testimony concerned global warming. In the course of that hearing, I asked Mr. Mayor about the scientific basis for his testimony. In particular, I asked him how he responded to the fact that the satellite data demonstrate no significant warming whatsoever for the past 18 years. Mr. Mayor, by all appearances, did not have the foggiest idea what the satellite data demonstrated. Indeed, he repeatedly turned to his staff members behind him and was unable to answer even basic questions. At the conclusion of the questioning, my friend, the ranking Democrat on the committee, Senator Cruz, stepped to Mr. Mayor's defense. And he said, in fact, I will read his quote directly. Senator Coons said, "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just simply wanted to observe that we have a broadly representative and qualified group of folks who were brought here to talk about overregulation and its impact on minority communities. And I do not speak for the Sierra Club, obviously, but it is my hope and expectation that if you want to pursue that line of inquiry with them further, they would be happy to." At that suggestion from Democratic Senator Coons that we hold a subsequent hearing on global warming, we have announced this hearing. Now, I did note at the time that the entire substance of Mr. Mayor's both written and oral testimony to the subcommittee concerned global warming, and yet he was unprepared to discuss even the basic science behind what he was testifying to. My office reached out to Mr. Mayor and invited him to come testify in this panel, and we did so in consultation with the chairman of the full committee, Senator Thune. Mr. Mayor turned down that invitation. And so, without objection, I'd like to enter into the record the written correspondence, the email between my office and Mr. Mayor extending the invitation, and the Sierra Club's response to that, declining to attend. In Mr. Mayor's honor, we have a spot at the table for him. I would note that it is striking the Sierra Club, a national advocacy organization that devotes the lion's share of its energy to advocating for global warming, was unwilling to come and defend the merits of its position based on the science or the data. To any fair or impartial observer, the Sierra Club's refusal even to engage in a discussion of the science should speak volumes. And with that, Dr. Christie, we're ready to receive your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would like to likewise enter into the record all the letters of invitation extended to the witnesses, and the record will note that there is no such letter of invitation to the gentleman that you're speaking about.
Without objection, and there was no formal letter issued because he had preemptively turned down the invitation on the front end. And with that, Dr. Christie.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz and Ranking Member Peters and Ranking Member Nelson, for this opportunity to speak about climate change. I'm John Christie, Professor of Atmospheric Science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville and Alabama State climatologist. I've served in many climate science capacities, including lead authorship of the United Nations IPCC. I, along with Dr. Curry, have the distinction of being 2 of the 7 scientists targeted by Representative Grijalva for investigation because our views about climate change differ from those of the administration. My research might best be described as building data sets from scratch for 50 years to help us understand what the climate is doing and what it might do and why it does what it does. The 2 main points of my verbal testimony are simple. First, the basis on which the popular view that human-caused climate change is dangerous does not pass simple validation tests. Secondly, the attempt to study climate change with an objective eye is thwarted by the federal funding process. Now, we at UAH monitor climate change for such variables as temperature. However, no one has a direct means to tell us why the temperature changes. Our thermometers only tell us what has happened. They do not tell us why it happened. There is really no way to prove why climate does what it does. No, so to try to understand why the changes occur, we make claims or hypotheses using climate models whose equations attempt to approximate all the important factors that affect the climate. If these equations are accurate, we can then see how each factor, such as greenhouse gases or volcanoes, might affect the climate, and therefore we could learn what the cause of these changes might be. Now, one variable, according to climate models, that has the largest response to extra greenhouse gases is the temperature of the bulk atmosphere, and this is the layer from the surface to about 50,000 feet in altitude. As shown in my written testimony, and as you can see on the chart to my left, the models fail this very simplest of validation tests. They can't even reproduce what has already happened in the past 37 years. 102 climate model runs warm up the bulk layer of the atmosphere by an average factor of 3 more than what has actually occurred. Now, being off by a factor of 3 does not qualify as settled science, in my view. Now, why are studies like this so hard to find? It goes back to this, the way federal funding occurs. Today, contrarian proposals, such as one I might write, that wants to say, look rigorously and test climate models against reality, or to test various ideas about how natural variability causes these changes, are rarely, if ever, funded. This is due to the fact the panels which decide this type of funding are dominated by those with the establishment point of view about dangerous climate change. Since there are many more proposals than funding allows, a contrarian proposal has essentially no chance of receiving funding because the panel decides these things by votes. Now, in my view, Congress needs to fix this problem by directly funding red teams, which are not part of the climate modeling industry, to test the basis for the claims that human-induced climate change is dangerous. The Congress needs objective eyes on this issue because it is such a big-ticket item for everyone involved. Now, it is no secret that the state of Alabama is in a desperate fight with the federal EPA. Our elected officials understand, as do I, their state climatologists, that the regulations being established will do nothing to alter whatever the climate is going to do. In fact, even if the United States of America disappeared today, no people, no cars, no factories, the impact would be negligible on whatever the climate does. Alabama is fighting for our industries, which are being tempted by lower costs in Mexico and China, where their emissions would actually rise if they move there. We are fighting for our utilities, which sell over 30% of their electricity production to nearby states who need it. And we are fighting for the many poor people in our state who do not need another hike in their utility rates to satisfy a regulation whose only impact will be to further drain their meager resources. This is a time when even so-called green countries like Germany and Japan, that's Germany and Japan, are adding to their carbon emissions by building more coal-fired power plants, while the rest of the world moves toward more carbon-based energy. To me, it is not scientifically justifiable or economically rational that this nation should establish regulations whose only discernible consequence is an increase in economic pain visited most directly and harshly on the poorest among us. This happens when the scientific process that allegedly underpins regulations lacks objectivity and transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christie. At this point in the hearing is when Mr. Aaron Mayer, the president of the Sierra Club, would be afforded his opportunity to present the Sierra Club's views on global warming. Unfortunately, as we discussed a minute ago, even though he was invited to present the Sierra Club's views, he chose not to attend, and presumably one reason for that is the last time he presented testimony on this topic, he was unable to answer even the most basic questions on the scientific basis for the political theory he was advancing that we should massively increase the federal government regulation of the economy and dramatically drive up the cost of living, the electricity bills of millions of hardworking Americans. And so we will not be hearing from Mr. Mayer now. Instead, we will hear from Dr. Curry.
I thank the chairman and the ranking members for the opportunity to offer testimony today. Prior to 2009, I felt that supporting the IPCC consensus on climate change was a responsible thing to do. I bought into the argument, don't trust what one scientist says, trust what an international team of 1,000 scientists has said after years of careful deliberation. That all changed for me in November 2009 following the leaked ClimateGate emails that illustrated the sausage making and even bullying that went into building the consensus. I started speaking out, saying that scientists needed to do better at making the data and supporting information publicly available, being more transparent about how they reach conclusions, doing a better job of assessing uncertainties, and actively engaging with scientists having minority perspectives. The response of my colleagues to this is summed up by the title of a 2010 article in the Scientific American. Climate heretic Judith Curry turns on her colleagues. I came to the growing realization that I had fallen into the trap of groupthink. I had accepted the consensus based on second-order evidence, the assertion that a consensus existed. I began making an independent assessment of topics in climate science that had the most relevance to policy. And what have I concluded from this assessment? Human-caused climate change is a theory in which the basic mechanism is well understood, but whose magnitude is highly uncertain. No one questions that surface temperatures have increased overall since 1880, or that humans are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, or that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have a warming effect on the planet. However, there is considerable uncertainty and disagreement about the most consequential issues, whether the warming has been dominated by human causes versus natural variability, how much the planet will warm in the 21st century, and whether warming is dangerous. The central issue in the scientific debate on climate change is the extent to which the recent and future warming is caused by humans versus natural climate variability. Research effort and funding has focused on understanding human causes of climate change. However, we have been misled in our quest to understand climate change by not paying sufficient attention to natural causes of climate variability, in particular from the sun and from the long-term oscillations in ocean circulations. Why do scientists disagree about climate change? The historical data is sparse and inadequate. There's disagreement about the value of different classes of evidence, notably the value of global climate models. There's disagreement about the appropriate logical framework for linking and assessing the evidence. And scientists disagree over assessments of areas of ambiguity and ignorance. How then and why have climate scientists come to a consensus about a very complex scientific problem that the scientists themselves acknowledge has substantial and fundamental uncertainties? Climate scientists have become entangled in an acrimonious political debate that has polarized the scientific community. As a result of my analyses that challenge IPCC conclusions, I have been called a denier by other climate scientists, and most recently by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. My motives have been questioned by Representative Grijalva in a recent letter sent to the president of Georgia Tech. There is enormous pressure for climate scientists to conform to the so-called consensus. This pressure comes not only from politicians, but from federal funding agencies, universities and professional societies, and scientists themselves who are green activists. Reinforcing this consensus are strong monetary, reputational, and authority interests. In this politicized environment, advocating for carbon dioxide emissions reductions is becoming the default, expected position for climate scientists. This advocacy extends to the professional society that publish journals and organize conference. Policy advocacy, when combined with understating the uncertainties, risks destroying science's reputation for honesty and objectivity, without which scientists become regarded as merely another lobbyist group. I would like to thank the committee for raising the issue of data versus dogma in support of improving the integrity of climate science. This concludes my testimony.
Thank you very much, Dr. Curry. Dr. Happer.
Here. Hope you can hear me. My name is William Happer. I recently retired from a career of 50 years of teaching physics at Princeton and Columbia universities. As the chairman mentioned, I served as Director of Energy Research, Office of Energy Research and Department of Energy from 1990 to 1993. And among the other projects I supported there was the Atmospheric Radiation Measurements Program, which is still going strong with facilities all over the world to measure basic climate data. After leaving the Department of Energy, I served as Princeton University's equivalent for Vice President for Research from 1995 to 2005. I guess I'm best known in the scientific community for inventing the sodium guide star that's used on all modern telescopes to compensate for atmospheric turbulence. So I've been very involved with the atmosphere for a very long time. So I'd like to, Mark, could you advance the slides? There's all this talk about carbon pollution, which of course is meant carbon dioxide pollution, and I'd like to set the record straight that carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. We're sitting in this room breathing out carbon dioxide at 40,000 parts per million every time we breathe out. We're fundamentally in a carbon dioxide famine, geologically speaking now. If you look at the geological history of the Earth, most of the time CO2 levels have been 3 times, 4 times what they are now. The Earth was just fine then. And in fact, at the present time, you know, many plants are having a hard time performing as well as they're designed to perform because the CO2 levels are too low and the oxygen levels are too high. I won't go into the details, but there's not much dispute about that. So the issue is not that CO2 is a pollutant. It's actually very, very good for the world. The issue is what will it do to temperature? And Dr. Christie very clearly showed, Mark, could you advance a few slides? Yes. A version of this display here, which is in Nature magazine, peer-reviewed. It's anything but a skeptic journal. But what it shows in dark bars are the predictions of various climate models of how much warming there would be over 2 time intervals from a 10-year interval, a 20-year interval. The red bar is what's observed, and you notice that the observed warming is much, much less than the predictions of climate models. Dr. Christie's chart was another version of that for the atmosphere, the lower atmosphere, and this is actually for surface data. So but the message is the same for both sets of data, that the climate models on which we're making policy do not work. They don't work. Okay, so let me move on to the fact that CO2 is a very important part of life on Earth. Mark, could you advance one slide? And one more, please. Just to limit my time here, let me just show you this picture, which shows the greening of the planet from 1982 to 2010. And so this is satellite images of certain wavelength bands that allow you to tell how much plant life there is. And what you see is that over most of the Earth, contrary to what you might have heard, the Earth is getting greener. And this is also clear from crop yields. Crop yields are going up. Some of that's fertilizer, some of that is better cropping practices. But a good fraction of it is CO2, probably 30% of the increase. Well, 15% of the increase in crop yields is due to the 30% increase of CO2 we've had in the past 100 years. So to call CO2 a pollutant is just completely wrong-headed. Now, I'd like to conclude by, Mark, could you advance one more? Arguing to support Dr. Christie's urging that we have a red team. I'm calling it a Team B, but You know, in most areas of science, science is so complicated that unless you have some adversarial process, you really can't be sure who's right. So, for example, when I was at Department of Energy, I didn't understand enough about nuclear weapons to know whether Livermore was right or Los Alamos was right, but I knew I could count on Livermore to catch any error in Los Alamos or vice versa. That's the reason we had 2 labs. It was that one could look after the other. We don't have 2 labs for climate. We have one organization, one world organization, the IPCC. We have one funding agency, you know, that follows IPCC, or, you know, and I would like to argue very strongly that we set aside some fraction of funding for climate research that is designed to be for the other side. So, for example, if you have some research that might show that CO2 is not such a big problem, you should be able to get funding. You shouldn't be last in line and turned away. That's the way it is in many other areas of human life. Even to become a saint in the Catholic Church, you have to pass a contested trial with the devil's advocate. You know, you can't be sainted without that. So every other region, every other aspect of human life has an adversarial process. This is the only one I know of that there's nothing adversarial in the science. And so I would like to argue to second Dr. Christie's request for a red team. And a team B also would be a good idea to have a real review of how well is science working. I know that there was a review of how well science works that both Dr. Christie and Dr. Curry took part in the American Physical Society. They did very well. And it was both sides. It was the only good review I know of. It was organized by Dr. Steve Koonin. And I noticed that when the list of organizations supporting climate alarmism was read, the one that wasn't there was the American Physical Society. Maybe that was an oversight. I hope not. I hope it was partly due to Dr. Curry and Dr. Christie, because it was a shattering workshop. So let me conclude my testimony here, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Happer, for being here. And I will say the one thing on which I think we can all agree is that no members of Congress will be made saints at any time in the foreseeable future. And Mr. Stein.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I'm not a scientist. I'm an author. And I'm also one of the 7 billion people on this planet that the governments assembled in Paris currently are presuming to determine the future of. So I have an interest in that as much as anybody else. I've listened to the examples that Senator Peters and Senator Nelson gave of toxic infestation in Michigan water and tidal flooding in the streets of Miami Beach. Nothing agreed at Paris is going to do anything for that. If you expect the agreement at Paris to end the tidal flooding in Miami Beach, you're going to be waiting a long time. So if you want to do something about the tidal flooding in Miami Beach, the mayor of Miami Beach and the governor of Florida are the guys who should get together and do it. This body is called the Subcommittee, I believe the full name, on Science, Space and Competitiveness. And the most important competitiveness in any healthy society is competitiveness in ideas. That is how ideas are tested, and that is how good ideas win out over bad. And only a very weak idea demands that it must be protected from any criticism. Professor Ivar Jeva, the Nobel Prize winner. By the way, when I say he's a Nobel Prize winner, I mean he's a real one. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1973, not a fraudulent Nobel Prize winner, like, unfortunately, large members of Rear Admiral Titley's faculty, Michael Mann, Richard Alley, William Easterling, all of whom have falsely claimed to be Nobel Prize winners on an industrial scale, as have many other climate scientists. there's never been a misrepresentation of credentials on this scale. It used to be a very serious business, but apparently it's not when your cause is, quote, saving the planet. But it is a revealing. It is this misrepresentation of credentials by people falsely claiming to be Nobel laureates is revealing, because it gets to the heart of the problem here, that they are attempting to cloak the science in an authority that it does not, in fact, possess. At any rate, Professor Java has compared the global warming orthodoxy to a hypothesis that you're not allowed to question. And it's gone beyond that in recent years. It's not only that you're not allowed to falsify the hypothesis, that the hypothesis is not in fact falsifiable, but that if you do, you suffer very serious consequences. Professor Christie and Professor Curry are very brave individuals, and they were very mild in their remarks about what Congressman Grijalva did when he sent out a disgraceful letter that no citizen representative in a parliament of a free society should be sending out to free individuals, demanding things like hotel expenses and email communication going back a decade. It was an absolutely disgraceful letter, and it represents the next stage of big climate enforcement. Your colleague, Senator Whitehouse, has called for the RICO laws about racketeering, to be used against those who disagree with him on climate science. When you need that, you're not dealing with science. You're effectively enforcing a state ideology. The Attorney General of New York is currently using securities law to do an end run around the First Amendment to chastise enemies of his who do not agree with him on the climate science. To take a milder example, Rear Admiral Titley has said that it is time, when it comes to global warming, it's time for the politicking to stop. Well, when you're calling for the politicking to stop, that is itself politicking, such as the Democrats on this committee who appeared at a press conference a couple of hours ago under a sign saying the debate is ended. I learned from Canada, in the battle I fought over free speech that Senator Cruz mentioned, I learned to always listen very carefully when someone is telling you to shut up. And although Rear Admiral Titley and the Democrat senators are doing it far more politely than Senator Whitehouse and Congressman Grijalva and the Attorney General of New York, what they're telling you is that this idea is so weak it cannot be subjected to the normal, vigorous debate of free society. So I thank this subcommittee for allowing at least to recognize that there is a divergence of opinion, the science is not settled, and the climate system of this planet is too complex for the slogans of cartoon climatology we're currently seeing in Paris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. Dr. Titley.
Thank you for Chairman Thune to extend this invitation to me. Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Peters, Ranking Member Nelson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you. This is an important hearing on an important subject. I'm here today as a private citizen. My views are my own. I got involved in climate in 2009. I was minding my own business as a one-star admiral, ran the Navy's oceanography and operational weather forecasting, got a call while driving to the New Orleans airport across the causeway in Lake Pontchartrain, and it was the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gary Ruffhead. He basically said, hey, Titley, figure out what's going on in the Arctic. Is this an issue or not? What's going on with climate? Do I need to deal with this? Come up to the Pentagon and figure this out. So I was a one-star, he's a four-star. So I said, aye, aye, sir. And that's what we did. And kind of what I looked at it as is really dropping back to the training. I was a navigator on an old guided missile destroyer. And we didn't have GPS. So you had to look at all the data, but not believe any one piece of data entirely. And that's kind of how I looked at this, because actually I wasn't really convinced one way or the other what was going on. So that's what I did. And the more we looked at the data, the more we saw that not only were the air temperatures coming up, but the ocean temperatures were coming up, the sea level was coming up, the glaciers were retreating, the oceans were acidifying, and as I said, the sea levels were actually rising. So when you put all of those independent lines of evidence together, coupled with a theory that was over 100 years old and had stood the test of time, it kind of made sense. Does it mean we know everything? No. But does it mean that we know enough that we should be considering this and acting? Yeah, it's called risk management, and that's what we were doing. So that's kind of where, in the science in general works there. Can you test your hypothesis? What is the cumulative weight of error? Can you replicate? What's the discovery? And over time, you can identify what's known with confidence. Not every publication is correct. That's okay. But it informs what we need to study over the next few years. So, basically, what do we know today about climate science? We know that the Earth's climate is changing at an unusual pace compared to the natural changes that the Earth has experienced in the past. We know emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities, primarily but not exclusively fossil fuels, are the principal drivers. We know it's already causing harm, as Senator Nelson's pointed out. We'll continue for some time. That harm will continue because there is inertia in the system. There's inertia in the physical system. There's inertia in the world's energy system. And we can limit that harm, though, by remedial action. In the military, you don't always have perfect information. In fact, you hardly ever have perfect information. But you still make decisions based on what you know, and we know a lot. General Sullivan, who serves with me on the CNA Military Advisory Board, famously said that if you wait for 100% certainty on the battlefield, you'll probably be dead. Let's not do that. We know in 2014, the CNA Military Advisory Board put out another report that talked about the climate risks are accelerating, the threats are being magnified, and the complex cascading consequences can lead to a failure of imagination. We've already experienced that in the last 15 years in this country. We don't need to do that again. So what do? We're already paying today a de facto carbon tax, one that nobody voted on. You look at the cost of the New Orleans levees. You look at the cost of Sandy. You look at the cost of Florida. You look at the cost of relocating communities in Alaska. Those are all carbon taxes, and we're paying those today. These are the impacts of society, not necessarily mid-tropospheric corrections to MSU data. These are the kinds of things that we gotta figure out. So what can we do? I'll use my last little bit of time here to really plead to the Congress that your leadership is essential. Big things happen in the United States with the Congress. The executive branch can do some things, they can't do a ton. We've seen this in the Department of Defense. Goldwater Nichols, that was a big change for the Department of Defense. Nuclear power. The way nuclear power came into the Navy is because the Congress made it happen. The Congress is massively important. Ultimately, we need to decarbonize our energy system. It's going to happen anyways, but the speed of that transition is important. And as it's being mentioned, there are 190 countries right now in Paris. So that energy system is going to transform. They're talking about this. Why don't we lead it? We've already heard the ranking member talk about that. Why don't we lead it? So here's my belief. I believe that we are still the exceptional country that much of the world looks to for leadership. I believe we all want a better life for ourselves, our children, our grandchildren. Please, let's not pull a Thelma and Louise. Let's get a better future. Let's start it today. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tetley, and thank you to each of the witnesses for testifying. Dr. Happer, I want to start with you, and I want to just make sure I understood your testimony correctly. As I understood what you told this committee, you had a series of facts, that CO2 is not a pollutant, that CO2 is good for the planet, that CO2 is good for plant life in particular, that the world right now is currently greening, and that for much of our history, there has been substantially more CO2 in the atmosphere than there is right now. Am I correct in understanding each of those facts?
That's completely correct. But by history, I mean since the last 500 million years, since the Cambrian.
And I would note that the history with markedly more CO2 predated the Industrial Revolution, so it didn't come from automobiles or the burning of carbon fuels. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so those are facts we're beginning with. I would note those facts are directly contrary to what the global warming alarmists tell us day in and day out, and to what the media, which echoes their concerns, say day in and day out. I want to pull up charts number 1 and number 2. I guess the bias on the charts is, of the computer models is causing the chart to fall over. So, Dr. Christie, this first chart here, the bright red line is, do I understand it correctly that the bright red line is what the computer models, and this is an average of quite a significant number of computer models, what the computer models said should be happening with our temperature, that we should see warming spiking like crazy. Is that correct?
Yes, and that's the bulk atmosphere where the biggest signal of greenhouse warming is supposed to be seen. So that's precisely where you want to measure it.
So we see the computer models, and if that were fact, we might have something to talk about. But the bottom line there, the blue and green, those are the actual measurements of what is in fact happening in the atmosphere. Is that correct, Dr. Christie?
Yes, and I think the nice thing about that chart, there's 7 different data sets involved in that observations there, not just one.
So when you compare alarmist theories, the red line, to actual facts, the blue and green dots, you see that the facts don't back up the theories, and we're being asked as a Congress to act and impose trillions of dollars of cost on humanity because of the red line theory that is not backed up by the facts. Is that correct?
I think so. In fact, going along with your hearing, you might want to say dogma is the red line, data is the blue and the green.
I think that is very well said. I would note this chart on the right, which shows for the last 18 years that there's been no significant warming whatsoever. Now that's directly contrary to what the data set showed. Now, Dr. Titley, I noticed in your written testimony that you took a moment to address what you described as the so-called pause in global temperatures. By the pause, are you referring to the last 18 years of no significant recorded warming?
Well, unlike your previous witness, I am not referring to the 1940s. It is, I thought you'd like that.
Indeed.
Yes. The pause is very interesting. As you know, sir, 1998, big El Nino. So it's kind of interesting we started 18 years. We don't look at a 15-year data set or a 10-year data set or a 20-year data set. We look at an 18-year data set. But even if you do that, that's fine. Let's look at that. We have... This is low budget here. I got to do my own charts. Thanks, Amanda.
Well, let me take a moment on...
So here's, sir, just to answer your question, Senator, here was 1998, and here's today. So on me, I mean, I'm just a simple sailor, but it's hard for me to see the pause on that chart. So I think the pause is kind of come and gone.
Do you dispute the satellite measurement?
Let's not talk about the satellite. Here's
But
okay,
sir,
well,
I'm asking, do you dispute? I understand that the global warming alarmists don't want to talk about the satellite data, but I'm asking.
Satellite. Let's talk about the satellite measurements. Let's talk about orbital decay. Let's talk about overlapping satellite records. Let's talk about stratospheric temperature contamination. I think Dr. Christie and Dr. Spencer, when they've put this out, they have been wrong, I think, at least 4 consecutive times. Each time the data record has had to be adjusted upwards. There have been several sign errors. So with all due respect, sir, I don't know which data exactly your staff has, whether it's the first or second or third or fourth correction to Dr. Christie's data. We used to have a negative trend, then we had no trend, and now we begrudgingly have an upward trend. So looking at those data, you know, it's okay. But here's where we live.
Let me see if I can understand. The first argument you gave in response to this, and it is an argument that a number of the global warming alarmists use, is they say, well, 18 years ago was El Nino, and it's arbitrary to begin there. And I will confess, I don't understand that argument because we have 18 years of no significant warming. So if you don't like an 18-year window, we can start in 1999. There's no significant warming for 7 years. If you don't like a 17-year window, we can start in 2000. Then we don't have a significant warming. It is true for any date across those 18 years. So I fail to see the significance.
Actually, Senator, it's not. If you take off that top really big spike and you take that out, you start getting the upward bias. And this is what people do when you start looking at these relatively arbitrary times, is you start with a really high number at the left-hand side, and that kind of influences your basically your linear trend. So when you start looking at things like every decade, you have an upward trend in the data, and that's from the World Meteorological Organization.
And I would note, you asked about the source of the data on the right chart. It's actually not Dr. Christie's data. It's the remote sensing systems, the RSS data that is up there. At this point, my time has expired, but we're going to have another round, and so we will return to questions on these topics. Senator Peters.
Thank you, and again, thank you to our panelists for your testimony here today. You know, it's interesting as I heard the testimony from folks and some of the comments that were being made that this is the so-called consensus of climate change and warming. I heard one of the panelists say the argument is so weak that it can't stand up to any other scrutiny. As I look at the facts, I don't understand where those comments are coming from. My understanding is that, and this is in a number of peer-reviewed journals that have looked at where scientists are, particularly those who are climate scientists, that roughly 97% of those folks in the profession believe that the climate is indeed changing and that humans had a significant aspect to it. But it's not just in the scientific community. We've got, in fact, just recently a letter of 150 of the leading companies in this country who are having to make business decisions and are concerned about changing climate. Companies important to me in Michigan, like General Motors and Kellogg, but also Coca-Cola, Walmart, UPS. It's a list of the who's who of companies in this country who believe this is a concern. We have some of my colleagues who are in Paris. Nearly 190 countries have come together realizing this is something that we have to deal with. So, you know, when you hear those numbers, that seems like there is overwhelming amount of scientific support. That's not to discredit the folks who are testifying here. Certainly your view is important, and we need to hear that. And I think, as Dr. Titley, you mentioned, nothing is ever 100%. And I want to pick up on that, and you mentioned it briefly in your comments as well, particularly as someone who was an admiral in the Navy and as a military person. We expect our Department of Defense to evaluate potential threats that we face to our national security, threats that we face as a country. If we have to go to war, our commanders have to make constant assessments of threats, and they rely on the intelligence community to give them data before they commit men and women into harm's way. People's lives could be at stake. These are huge decisions, serious decisions, ones that I know commanders agonize about, but they know if they make the wrong decision, the consequences could be even more significant. So I spent some time in the Navy as well, and I don't know that an intelligence report will ever give you 100% certainty. In fact, they will give you all sorts of caveats in providing any kind of intelligence assessment. So speaking as a man from the military, if you're an operational commander and someone said, we can give you 97% confidence but not 100, is that going to be enough? And really, speak to what sort of certainty you're going to need.
Senator, thanks for the question, sir. If somebody could tell me with 97% certainty what's going to happen on the battle space or in the operating environment, I mean, you would take that in a heartbeat. Our intelligence community does wonders. They've been supported by the Congress, supported by the administration, tremendous hardworking men and women. But if the intelligence community could tell you as much as the climate community could about the state of the world 50 years from now, you know, we would find General Clapper, whatever he's doing today, stop him, fly him to the White House, and give him the Presidential Medal of Freedom this afternoon, because that would be just an outstanding feat. Now, this is not a knock on the intelligence community. They're dealing with people. They're trying to deal with people who deceive us. We're just dealing with physics. The physics isn't trying to deceive anyone, and we understand the basic theory. We certainly don't understand everything, and we certainly do understand that there are short and medium-term variations, ups and downs, some of which we do pretty well on, others not so much. That's where we need research. That's where we need better observations. But the degree of certainty that you ask for, sir, we would love to have that for operational commanders making military decisions.
And certainly that's in weather decisions. You're a part of the meteorology, or for a part of meteorology with the Navy as a meteorologist. What level of certainty on weather forecasts is acceptable to mission commanders that make operational decisions? Obviously, they don't go into battle without checking with you and other meteorologists.
Yes, sir. Usually they would say, shut up, Titley, don't give me that weather stuff, just tell me what's going to happen. So what they are looking for, but they do understand risk. In all seriousness, people do understand risk. Sometimes weather forecasts are take it to the bank. It's going to start snowing at whatever time. Other times, like hit and miss showers, like with the ranking member, in Florida, trying to figure out where that thunderstorm is and is not is pretty tricky. But you can communicate that in terms of risk, in terms of probabilities, and that's really when you extend into climate. This is all we're doing. I think anybody who says, you have 100% of whatever, you probably don't. But if you start having significant numbers and you look at the impacts, that's the other part of risk, is what's the impact if you're wrong? And then how do you buy that down? How do you manage that risk so that it becomes acceptable? And that's what we're trying to do.
And that's the thing, is the risk that could be potentially catastrophic or go anywhere from bad to catastrophic. But you mentioned, and I mentioned the short-term weather effects. If you would just briefly, my time is about up, but briefly, there is a difference between weather events and climate. And I think that's oftentimes confusing to folks. It is to me. Could you elaborate why short-term weather events, we shouldn't spend too much time focusing on those and instead need to be looking at the long-term impact of climate change?
Yes, sir. I often tell people you live in weather and you plan for climate. Climate is simply this amalgamation, or this put together in space and time, over decades, over large regions. Those are the trends. That's climate, up, down, whatever it is. Weather is day to day, and even out to a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And then in between is where it gets interesting. And, when we talk about 18 years, this is an interesting time. You have some ocean pieces, but also climate, and you get these interactions here, and this is the interesting time. Long term, though, we know where the climate is going.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing today. Ranking members Peters, Nelson, thank you. I do not have a Nobel Prize, just for the record to be clear. I do have a degree in chemical engineering. I'm the only chemical engineer in the Hills, so I very much appreciate and I like being on this science kind of debate and on this committee. My home state of Montana is well known for its beautiful landscapes, pristine environment, and clearly we have a moral responsibility to be good stewards of that environment. But Montana families also rely on our natural resources. We're called the treasure state for a reason. And it's not because of elk antler furniture and huckleberry jam, as much as we enjoy those things. We're called a treasure state because of our natural resources, which include coal. These are good-paying jobs it creates. It's reliable, affordable energy. And I believe Montanans and most Americans believe we can achieve a balanced approach of protecting our environment as well as ensuring we have affordable energy. I can tell you there's a lot of concern about the regulations that are coming out of the conclusions of debates like we're having here today and the magnitude of these devastating impacts on families. The University of Montana, which is not a conservative think tank, my dad's a proud graduate of the University of Montana, but I will tell you, they just published a study on the Clean Power Plan, which probably should be called the Unaffordable Energy Plan. And that study stated that the Clean Power Plan could potentially be the largest economic event to occur in Montana in more than 30 years. Here's what the study said, coming out of the EPA's Clean Power Plan. It'll cost us 7,000 jobs, $500 million a year in annual income, and the loss of $145 million in tax revenues for our schools and for our teachers. 2 weeks ago, I had a telephone town hall. We had thousands of Montanans participating and concerned about these regulations. What do? What do we tell the Boilermaker union workers back in Montana who lose their jobs? What do we tell senior citizens and the working poor who are on fixed incomes and looking at significant and huge increases in energy costs as a result of these regulations from Washington, D.C.? Let's remember the facts and the data. The United States consumes 10% of the coal in the world, 10%. Said another way, 90% is consumed outside of our country. In Montana, 51% of our electricity comes from coal. I love Tesla automobiles. I have a friend that has a Tesla. It's great to see him plug that into the charging station there in Bozeman. But the reality is, in the back of that Tesla, it should say, this Tesla is powered by coal. That's where the electricity is coming from to power that Tesla. But you think about the United States, about 40% of our electricity comes from coal. Look at the numbers, 27% from natural gas, 19% nuclear, 6% hydro, 4% wind, and 0.4% solar. Now, with that as background, as we think about the global challenges that we face as we look at carbon and so forth, with 10% coming from the United States and 90% outside, we ought to be making sure this is a global conversation and not unilaterally disarming our economy through these regulations coming out of Washington, D.C. China is building a new coal-fired plant every 10 days. Japan, I used to have an office in Tokyo. I had a private sector job for 28 years before I came to Congress a few years ago. I had an office in Tokyo. Japan's building 43 coal-fired plants as we speak, looking to the future. And yet, these regulations are going to absolutely kill our economy and kill our natural resource industry that are coming out of the EPA. Dr. Christie, in your testimony, you mentioned the importance of affordable and accessible energy and the importance to human health and welfare. I remind everybody in this room that 1.3 billion people in the world today do not have electricity. What impact will the Clean Power Plan have on greenhouse gases, and what impact will it have on the well-being of families?
First of all, I lived in Africa, and I can assure you that without energy, life is brutal and short. The effect of these regulations will have negligible impacts on both the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and on whatever the climate might do as a result. And we calculated many scenarios in that regard.
And so if it's negligible, now we can quantify the impact on tax revenues, on jobs, on energy prices, and what that means for, as you said, a negligible impact. And we've heard similar kinds of conversations and comments actually from the EPA on that very point. Do you realize China, and the New York Times was reporting here just a month ago, that China has been underreporting their emissions by a quantity equivalent to 70% of the total U.S. emissions. That's what their underreporting has been. Should we consider such costly remedies as what's going on right now with this Clean Power Plan for merely symbolic changes?
Well, if you're asking a state climatologist who deals with economic development of a poor state, basically, I would say no. There's no consequence that is positive that I see in regulating energy in this way.
Dr. Curry, in your testimony you explain how funding motivates research. The Clean Power Plan not only harms workers, but it stifles investments that could lead to innovation and make coal cleaner. I would hope that the U.S. would be leaders in innovation, because as we lead in innovation and cleaner technologies, we can not only lead our country, we can lead the world as we look at the environment here. What can be done, in your opinion, to incentivize objective research that can make affordable energy sustainable?
Well, that's a topic. I mean, I applaud the goal that you state. We need more research and development on advanced energy technologies. How to effect that, private sector government, is a challenge for politicians. I don't have any particular insight as a scientist as to how that might work, but in terms of having, you have to allow people to have opportunity to fail. And if you're going to look for blue sky technologies and something really innovative, you have to have a mechanism that allows people to fail. You need maybe 3 good ideas, and this may mean, 50 or 100 of them have to be tried before you find a few good ones that are going to work. And so pretending that wind energy and at least the current solar technology are going to solve the problems is fairly ludicrous.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Senator Nelson. Sure. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Members Nelson and Peters. Thank you for having this hearing. It gives us an opportunity to clarify that climate change is real, it's caused by humans, and it's solvable. And only in the four corners of the United States Capitol is that still being debated. It's ironic that we're holding this hearing in the committee with jurisdiction over science, because this committee is turning its back on the real science. Now, I suppose that it's possible that what the four people on the left-hand side of this dais are saying is true, which is that basically everybody else is wrong, that everybody else is wrong. But I think it's more likely that 97% of the scientists have come independently to the same conclusion. Scientists should and do receive federal research dollars based on the merit of their work, not on their conclusions. The only reason that so few climate deniers or skeptics, whichever you prefer, as a percentage of the whole receive federal support for their research is because the vast majority of scientists independently come to the same conclusions, that the climate is changing due to human activity. A review of nearly 12,000 peer-reviewed journal articles over 20 years found that 97% of those articles and 98% of scientists agree that humans are influencing the climate. The vast majority of climate scientists around the world will tell you that greenhouse gas emissions, primarily from the burning of fossil fuels, have increased the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, which in turn has raised average global temperatures. Now, I suppose everybody could be wrong. In fact, the American Academy for the Advancement of Science has said the science linking human activities to climate change is analogous to the science linking smoking to lung and cardiovascular diseases. There may be a doctor out there who doesn't believe there is a connection between smoking and lung cancer, but I would keep that doctor away from me and my family. Just as there is no genuine scientific debate over whether we are responsible for changing the climate, there is also no global conspiracy to manufacture data. The skeptics do not know more than the National Academies of Science, NASA, the DoD, the CIA, the American Chemical Society, the American Physical Society, the American Medical Association, the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, the American Society of Plant Biologists, the National Academies of Science from 80 countries, the World Health Organization, NATO, and a litany of other organizations. I, for one, believe that the Department of Defense has to contend with what is, not with how we view, how we wish things would be. And my question is for Admiral Titley. Could you please describe the relationship between CO2 in the atmosphere and global temperature?
Senator, thank you for the question, sir. I give some talks into public on this, and basically what I tell people is what you've asked me is cutting-edge 19th century science here. A bunch of old dead white guys figured this stuff out, starting with Fourier, Arnhus, Tyndall. By the time you get to 1896, we were actually doing calculations of global warming. Now, it was with stubby pencil and paper, but we actually kind of figured it out. So in basic terms, energy comes in at one wavelength. Energy comes back out through the atmosphere at a different wavelength. The carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases actually re-radiate that longer wavelength. The short stuff comes in from the sun. The long stuff gets basically bounced around, reabsorbed, readmitted, and that's really good for us. If we did not have greenhouse gases, we wouldn't all be here because we'd be living on an ice cube. It would be about 59 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it is right now. So greenhouse gases provide life on Earth, but there can be too much of a good thing. And we have literally formed human civilization in a period of wonderful climate stability, where we have not been varying either the greenhouse gases or much of the other part of the atmosphere. So we've had this stability. Now, as we inject a whole lot of extra greenhouse gases, they're just doing what physics does. So they're re-radiating, warming the atmosphere, as you talked about, sir.
And tell me about the observations on page 3 of your testimony. It seems to me that there's a nearly one-to-one relationship between global temperatures, CO2, fossil fuel consumption, and sea level and ocean temperature. Is that about right?
Yes, sir. Everybody here at this table knows that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causality, but there has been a lot of work shown to show.
How would you establish causality in an experiment involving our planet?
We only have one planet. That makes it kind of tough to run the control case, if you will. So this is what the computer models help you with. But
Thank you.
we only have one planet. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Senator Schatz, could I comment on that? You said that the 4 people...
Mr. Chairman, I do have a meeting at 4:30, and I did not ask a question of Mr. Stein. I apologize. I do have to go. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to make a comment on what
You're welcome to give a response, sure.
I'd like to make a comment on what he said, because he said that these people represent a tiny minority point of view. The 97% consensus from these papers does not argue for the kind of measures that are being discussed here today. We are talking about the greatest, just to take the pro-climate people at their word, we are talking about the greatest shift in the global economy that has ever been contemplated. We hear a lot of talk about risk management. This is a hell of a risk. And it requires, if we are to take these pro-climate people at their word, it would require the greatest societal consensus, left, right, and center across North America, Europe, and the developing world. So to exclude, if you exclude Professor Christie, if you exclude Professor Curry, if you exclude Professor Happer, if you exclude the French weatherman who basically just lost his job for writing a book countering climate change, if you refuse Professor Leonard Benson, whose career was destroyed because he wanted to meet with a skeptic think tank, the great Swedish climatologist, if you exclude the Nobel Prize winner in physics from 1973 and the Nobel Prize winner in physics from 1988, you wind up with what has happened to climate alarmism, where the poll showed, the real 97% consensus, that only 3% of Americans view this as their overriding priority. The point that Admiral Titley made about things we could do, he brought up Superstorm Sandy as an example of climate change. You know what would have stopped Sandy? If they'd built the same storm barrier that the Dutch coast has, that the Russians have in St. Petersburg, and that London has with the Thames barrier. For a couple of $1 billion, you wouldn't have had water in the New York subway. But instead, when we talk about all the saving the planet stuff, the flood barrier never gets built. And that's what elected legislators should focus on, the real issues involving them now, not the pie in the sky stuff.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. And I would note Dr. Titley made reference to dead white guys, and in response to Senator Schatz's question about 97% of scientists in this one bogus and discredited study, in the year 1615, I suspect if you asked 97% of scientists at the time would have said categorically that the sun rotates around the earth. And yet an individual named Galileo dared to actually be a scientist and take measurements and stand up to that enforced consensus. And I would note, it was the Roman Inquisition that brought heretics before it who dared to say that the earth rotates around the sun. And today, the global warming alarmists have taken the language of the Roman Inquisition, going so far as labeling anyone who dares point to the actual science as a denier, which is, of course, the language of religion. It is calling someone a heretic. And anytime you hear people saying scientists should not question the conventional wisdom, you are hearing someone advocating essentially for the abolition of science. Senator Udall.
Chairman Cruz, thank you very much. And, you know, today we're having a hearing on climate change science. And while this is an extremely important topic and great for senators to engage on, I'm disheartened by the frame here. It's called Data or Dogma is part of this title of this hearing. And quite clearly, this hearing was called to inject controversy and skepticism into the issue of climate science and research, to cast doubt on the work of many scientists, including those at American universities in all of our states, the national laboratories. New Mexico has 2 of those national laboratories, and the National Academy of Sciences, who have been researching the effects of climate change and the impacts that humans are having on the climate. This year is almost over. It will likely be the warmest year on record, and the current record holder last year, 2014. The impact is clear, and people are seeing it all over the world with rising sea levels and increased drought. The Southwest is in the eye of the storm. In New Mexico, temperatures are rising 50% faster than the global average, not just this year or last year, but for decades. Through all of this, Congress has been slow to act. We could be using this time right now to push forward on strong, comprehensive energy policies that curb greenhouse gas emissions. So I want to turn to you, Dr. Titley. I was really interested in your role as the lead oceanographer for the U.S. Navy and your history of 32 years of service in the Navy. And I have a simple question for you. Do we have time to waste, in your opinion?
Senator, thanks, sir. There's a saying in the Navy and naval aviation that the 2 things that are of no use to you is altitude above you or runway behind you. Right now, we're putting runway behind us. Now, how much more there is, that's hard to say, but we are certainly taking time that we should be using to start mitigating this. And actually, some of the other witnesses have brought up some things. I think Dr. Curry talked about more research and development for energy. We need to transform our energy system. The federal government, the Congress can be very, very helpful on that. So, but we are not doing that right now, sir, because we have these debates which is fine, but at some point we need to do something.
And you believe, I think, that it would be very prudent to look at the science, which is overwhelming, and we've heard the 97, 98%, and proceed to do something in a bipartisan way that's constructive and find solutions. Were you always convinced that climate change is occurring?
I was, I think there's a YouTube video out there or a TEDx talk I did. They talked about, I was kind of a skeptic. As I think, as the chair introduced me, I have my degrees are in meteorology. You see a lot of day-to-day variation in weather. And you also see when you take a look at weather models, back when I was started, back in the dark ages of the 70s, after about 3 days, they weren't really worth very much. So it took me, honestly, a while to realize that in weather, it really matters about how do you start those models. It's called initial conditions for the science folks. Whereas the climate models really work on boundary conditions. It's like how much energy is coming in, how many greenhouse gases do we have, where are the continents, where are the oceans? And you realize that, and this is why the climate models are useless at telling you what it's going to be like today or tomorrow, things like that. But they're pretty good at the overall trend. So when I looked at that, and frankly, I was asked by the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gary Ruffhead, to look at this for the Navy. I just said, well, what's the evidence show? And that's where it really, I came to it. So, you know, I'm probably like the reformed smoker, but it was really just simply looking at all these independent lines of evidence. That, to me, said, we've got an issue here, and we're going to have to do something.
And Doctor, the evidence is right behind you on that chart. That's the evidence you're talking about.
Just one
yeah,
line.
one
but
data
we could have
point,
a chart like that for the rising seas and for many, many other lines.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
And do you believe science has progressed on climate change?
I think the evidence has shown that science in many fields, and including climate, it's not a nice linear process, but fits and starts. So when you take things like, whether it's different observation techniques, I mean, there's a paper that just came out, I think I saw a day or two ago from NASA measurements talking about maybe more snow in Antarctica. We're going to have to look at that. But that's interesting. So we get these ups and downs, but overall, and we've seen this in the IPCC and many other conclusions, that the level of confidence that the basic theory of greenhouse gases from the 19th century is in fact correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much for having this hearing. And hopefully this will go better than Galileo, because Galileo was put under house arrest, Dr. Titley, in 1633. And the Catholic Church did not issue an apology to Galileo until 1992. So we wish you a long life so that 359 years from now you can get the apology you deserve for actually using scientific data to back up your arguments here today. 2014 is the warmest year ever recorded. Is that correct, Dr. Titley?
Yes, Senator, that's what I understand.
That's what you understand. Now, what would that be based on? Science?
A whole lot of thermometers, yes, sir.
A whole bunch of thermometers, a very, very sophisticated technology. So this is going back to the beginning of the measurement of the temperature of the planet using thermometers. So that goes back to 1880, 1870. Now, I'm told that the first 6 months of this year are the warmest 6 months ever recorded on the history of the planet. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, and I think that now extends to the warmest November as well, so we're up to 11 months in counting.
The warmest October and the warmest November now ever recorded using thermometers, the same measurement for about 150 years right now. Very, clear calculations that have been made. And so, I guess we're pretty much 150 years into the 359 years to getting kind of the apology from those who are the deniers. Now, in Paris right now, we've got just about every single, scientist in the world, every country in the world is there, all saying the planet is dangerously warming and that the cause of it is human activity. Even the Pope said that. It's dangerous to name a Jesuit who taught high school chemistry. You actually get somebody who says that, it is happening and it's caused by human beings and that there's a moral responsibility to do something about it. So this panel that we have in this committee, this last redoubt of denial, on the planet, of all the countries on the planet, this last place, has the flip of witnesses that we have every other place. We have 4 here who deny it and 1 who believes in the science. And so we clearly here are at a historic moment. And there'll be a day when you get your apology, Dr. Titley, for being kind of the sacrificial lamb here, like Galileo, standing up for actual science. And so what we have here is just one of the clear national security challenges of our time, just as we were focused on protecting the planet from the threat of communism in the 1950s, we need to be focused on protecting the planet from the threat of climate change now. We sit here in the space, the science, and the competitiveness subcommittee, which has oversight over NASA. We should all be cognizant of the fact that NASA was established in 1958, when this country felt the very real threat of communism. If we had ignored that threat in the 1950s, America wouldn't be the leader it is today. And it was in response to the threat of communist domination in space when 53 years ago, President Kennedy announced the ambitious goal of sending an American safely to the moon. He told us that we would need a giant rocket made of new metal alloys, some of which had not yet been invented. It would have to be fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, and it would have to be returned to Earth safely at speeds never before reached by humans, and it would all have to be done in less than 8 years. President Kennedy urged us to be bold, and America responded to his call, not by saying it couldn't be done, not by denying the threat, but by boldly putting our scientists and our engineers to work protecting our nation and the world. Today, a growing global danger lies in the cascading impacts of climate change. Temperatures are increasing. Sea levels are rising. More extreme rains are falling. The ocean is becoming more acidic. And all of this has consequences for people, public health, and for prosperity. That's why our national security, military, and intelligence leaders have warned that a changing climate can worsen the tensions that are fueling terrorism and conflicts around the world. More than 50 years ago, we looked to the scientific community to help protect our nation from communism. Today, the same scientific rigor we use to send astronauts to space is used to evaluate our changing climate. And just as President Kennedy urged our nation to be bold in the space race, the global community is meeting in Paris right now to hold bold action to protect our climate. But the Republicans' message to the world is, Houston, we do not have a problem.
No.
And that is the wrong scientific message. They are once again questioning the integrity of the scientific community and the basic scientific principles behind climate change. The truth is, the only thing that requires a serious scientific investigation is why we are holding today's hearing in the first place. Climate science stands on a foundation of more than 150 years of research. Laboratory experiments demonstrated carbon dioxide traps heat in the same year that Charles Darwin published On the Origin of the Species. So we should listen to the planet's doctors. The more fossil fuels we burn, the more carbon pollution we put in the air, the higher the risk for catastrophic climate consequences. But the Republicans' response to this existential challenge is to insist that the brightest minds of the United States of America, who once figured out how to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely, can't possibly figure out how to generate energy from anything other than burning decaying plants that have been sitting underground since the time of the dinosaurs. But we all know that failure is not an option. There is no planet B. We must solve this problem. The science dictates that we solve this problem. It is time to stop denying the science and start deploying the climate solutions. Admiral Titley, we've heard a lot about temperature measurements today. When I'm feeling sick and I go to the doctor, she takes my temperature, but the doctor always checks my blood pressure, listens to my heart and lungs, and looks at my ears, eyes, and throat to get a broader assessment of my health. This chart behind me is NOAA's assessment of the Earth's climatic vital signs. Yes, temperatures are going up, but so is the heat in the ocean, the sea level, and the humidity. And snow and glaciers and Arctic sea ice are going down. Do you agree, Dr. Titley, that a wide range of independent observations indicate that the planet is warming and the climate is changing, and that there are no emergency rooms for planets, and we have to engage in preventative care?
Yes, sir.
What would you say is the basis for your decision? Is it based on data, or is your answer based on dogma?
It's based on the evidence, sir.
It's based on the evidence, and I agree with you, Admiral, and I thank you so much for your service to our country, both in the active Navy and here today before this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Nelson.
Dr. Carey wanted to respond to Senator.
Is
Sure,
it possible
Dr.
for me to respond? You basically,
I did not ask you a question.
Really? Why can't she respond, Senator?
I was-
Dr. Curry, you're
You impugned her integrity. I think she's entitled to.
You are welcome to respond, Dr.
I was basically called a denier that I'm denying science. Did you read my written testimony? Are you aware that the IPCC and the consensus has no explanation for the increase of ice in the Antarctic? Are you aware that they have no explanation for the fact that the rate of sea level rise from 1920 to 1950 was as large, if not larger, as it currently is? Are you aware that temperatures have been warming for more than 200 years, and that in the 20th century, 40% of the warming occurred before 1950, when carbon dioxide was not a factor in the warming? Okay, and I could go on and on. Many of these issues are raised in my written testimony. And most of it is pulled from the IPCC itself. The IPCC has an explanation for, so it says, for warming during the period 1975 to 2000. It doesn't have an explanation for the flat period since 2000. It doesn't have an explanation for the early century.
Doctor, as I just said in my testimony, corroborated by Dr. Titley, this is the warmest year ever recorded. Last year is the warmest year ever recorded until this year. This is the warmest November ever recorded. October is the warmest October ever recorded. You do not have an answer for that, Dr. Mann.
Yes.
You continue to ignore the chart which Dr. Titley has over his left shoulder. He has documented for this committee the warming trend, which is inexorable, inevitable in terms of its consequences unless we take action here. That's the science you're having a hard time in responding to.
The issue
here,
is
Dr.
what
Mayer.
is causing the warming. Is it natural variability or is it humans?
Like Galileo, he said, no, the science.
Are you aware?
The science is clear. You are depending upon something that perhaps is God-made rather than dependent upon something that is man-made, which is anthropogenic and documented by 97% of all of the science.
Are you saying there's no natural variability, Senator? There were alligators at the North Pole. What was that? Was that you in your SUV?
What I am saying is that this warming is something that, while it may have a variability year to year in specific parts of the planet, that the trend is straight up.
Yeah. Do you know what the Little Ice Age was, Senator?
And again, it is climate change. We had 110 inches of snow in Boston last year with measurements of water 21 degrees warmer than normal off of the coast of Massachusetts. Okay, this was an unusual event for us. The warming of the ocean intensifies the amount of precipitation when Arctic air hits that water. Now, if you want to deny that, if you want to ignore that these changes are taking place and that they're having a dramatic impact, then you are in the right place.
Do you know what the winters were like at Plymouth Rock? Do you know what the winters were like at Plymouth Rock, Senator?
Well, here is the thing.
You don't. How long has your family been in Massachusetts?
We are new arrivals, and I have to admit—
You should have been there in 1750.
The Irish weren't arriving in 1750, so I apologize for being late to the country, and I'll have to chastise my grandparents for not leaving until the economic conditions in 1902 forced them here. But that notwithstanding, there is as much consensus that man is causing climate change as there is in Galileo's original theory. And
what percentage of climate change is man causing, Senator?
Excuse me, sir?
What percentage of climate change is anthropogenic?
Well, according to the scientists who are in Paris right now, which would fill pretty much the entire space of the building in which we're in right now, and the number of deniers would still be the ones who are active.
Yeah, what's the percentage, Senator?
Are you aware of a recent survey of the professional members of the American Meteorological Society? When asked the question, how much is the recent changes natural versus human cause, 52% of the membership said it was majority human cause.
Dr. Titley, could you respond to that question in terms of what you believe is the amount of warming that is relatable to human activity?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. Right now, there is, as has been pointed out, there are natural variations, things like volcanoes, things like changes in sunlight, and then there's something called internal variations. These are the oscillations or basically the back and forth of the ocean currents. So even if you had no change in forcing, but what we are doing is we are changing in forcing, and I think the IPCC has come down pretty strong along with multiple National Academy panels saying that the human-caused forcing is very, very significant. That doesn't mean there isn't natural variability. It doesn't mean there is not internal variability. But the human-caused forcing is very significant, and that's, I think, what we need to deal with.
Thank you,
And
Dr.
I,
Chipman.
if I just make, I agree with you, and I agree with this Pope. I disagree with the Pope in 1632. This Pope is correct, and we have a moral responsibility to act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My approach to this is a little more coolly aloof and look at facts. Admiral, the chart behind you, is that a measurement of surface temperature?
Senator, thank you, sir. It is near surface temperatures. Basically, it's about 10 feet above the, 6 to 10 feet above the surface. So for all intents and purposes, it's surface temperatures.
That surface temperature would reflect that heat, most of which is absorbed by the oceans. Why don't you give us your perspective on that as an admiral?
Thanks, sir. The oceans are absorbing roughly 90%, 90% of the excess heat. What I told people is that if you think of the, when you study climate, try to get more and more oceanographers involved, and the oceanographers are certainly involved because that's where the action is, that's where the heat is. Sort of like, why did Willie Sutton rob banks? That's where the money was. So the heat is in the oceans, and then the atmosphere is sort of the tail on the dog. The atmosphere gets sort of driven ups and downs depending on what the ocean is doing. So the heat is in the ocean, sir.
And when water is heated, what happens to it?
It expands.
Right. And therefore, that would indicate a reason why we are seeing sea level rise.
Yes, sir.
Not just the melting of glaciers and that additional displacement of water, but mainly from the absorption of the oceans, which cover 2/3 of the Earth, of the heat, the absorption of the heat. Is that right?
Yes, sir. The scientists would call it thermal expansion. It's the expanding of the water.
Are you familiar with a satellite? It's really not a satellite. It's a spacecraft named Discover that was put up earlier this year at a Lagrange point 1 million miles from Earth, between the Earth and the Sun.
Yes, sir. I think it's at what the scientists would call L1.
That's correct. There is an instrument. There are 4 main instruments on that spacecraft. But there is an instrument that looks back continuously at Earth to measure the heat in and heat out. If, in addition to our surface temperatures and other instruments that measure, if we get the total amount of heat being radiated into the Earth's atmosphere, and we measure the total amount of heat coming out and subtract one from the other, we should be able to have a very precise measurement of the amount of heat that is trapped in the Earth's atmosphere.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, this heat that's trapped in the atmosphere, the sun's rays come in, and normally when they hit the Earth's surface, some are absorbed, but some radiate back out into space. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
If there is something trapping that heat from being radiated back out into space, you naturally would start to have the heating up of the Earth's atmosphere. And you, as a climatologist, would you speculate that that would be gases such as CO2 and SO2?
Senator, yes. I mean, not as a climatologist, but just basic physics. There are greenhouse gases that re-radiate or trap, as you said, the heat, and that actually allows us to have life on Earth. Yes, sir.
So that could be another reason that reflects why the surface measurements are showing the chart that you have.
As we increase the greenhouse gases, the temperature should come up, and that's what we're seeing. Yes, sir.
Would you answer one more question? And we have not covered this today. The Department of Defense is quite concerned about the heating up of the Earth because of the implications for our national security. Would you trace a few of those for us?
Yes, sir. So the Department of Defense, in their 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review, they talk about climate change really in three ways. They talk about increasing risk of conflict and instability overseas, the impacts of Department of Defense operations on operations, people, and installations, and also the impact of stability, development, human security in other nations. That was in 2014. Later on in 2014, the Department of Defense, they released their climate change adaptation roadmap. Really that assessed climate change. It directed the department to assess climate change impacts on infrastructure, missions, and activities, fully integrate climate considerations across a full range of department missions and activities, collaborate with partners, internal and external, to better understand what's going on. And also a bureaucratic part, they designate a climate change officer. If I may, sir, just one more thing. Just a few months ago, the Geographic Combatant Commanders released an assessment. They report to the Congress. So these are the four-star admirals and generals who have direct control over the operating forces. They report to the Secretary of Defense and President. They had four issues, primarily issues: persistently recurring conditions such as flooding, drought, higher temperatures, more frequent and more severe extreme weather events that may require more humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or support of defense support of civil authorities here in the United States. The sea level rise and the temperature change, greater chance of flooding in coastal communities, adverse effects impacting navigation safety, damages to infrastructure, displaced populations, and then finally the Arctic. As the Arctic changes, that's a whole category to itself. I'll stop there, sir, but those are just some of the more recent documents that the Department of Defense has released concerning climate change.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. All right, we're going to have a second round, and then the hearing will conclude. I want to start, Dr. Curry. When Senator Markey was haranguing you, he said that you had no response to his assertion that 2014 was the hottest year on record. Am I correct that NASA stated that assertion, that 2014 was the hottest year on record, that they had a 38% level of confidence in that, which means that 62%, or substantially more likely than not, 2014 was not the hottest year on record? Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, basically 2014 was, according to the NASA and NOAA data sets, in a statistical tie with 2010 and 2005. The UK data set, which has, I think, more credible error bars on their data set, found that it was in the top 10 warmest years. They couldn't fine-tune it any more than that, given the great uncertainties in the reconstruction of global surface temperature data. And I think the uncertainty levels are really too low on all of those estimates, in my opinion.
And indeed, NOAA included 2014, 2010, 2005, 2013, and 1998, 5 different years, as potentially being tied for being the warmest.
Correct.
The last hearing I chaired, when Mr. Mayor, who should have been sitting next to you, testified, he told the subcommittee, quote, "Our planet is cooking and heating up and warming." Does the evidence and data we've been discussing support the assertion that the planet is cooking?
Not cooking, no.
And indeed, another reference was made by Senator Markey to the measurements. Now, I would note, none of the Democratic senators who participated in a press conference earlier today saying, how dare you ask the data, not a single Democratic senator addressed the satellite data. Not a single Democratic senator addressed the fact that for 18 years, there has been no significant warming recorded, because I suppose it is contrary to their computer model and to their political desire to massively increase government control of the economy and impose trillions of dollars of cost on people who can't afford it. But let's turn to the different measurements, not the satellite data, and if we can put up the next two charts. These next two charts are from the United States Historical Climate Network. These are the measurements of the thermometers that are measuring climate change. And these in particular record the adjustments that NOAA has done to the climate data. Chart on the left, you can see that between 1900 and 1960, NOAA made relatively few adjustments, and they were relatively minor. And then we see that for the more recent years, they've been adjusting them upwards. And the adjustments consistently are upwards. They're never adjusting downward. Now, the chart on the right likewise looks at the raw numbers are on the top. The raw numbers demonstrate a fair degree of uniformity. But the adjusted numbers, the old temperatures are cooler and the new temperatures are warmer.
Well, there's a number of different groups who do global temperature data sets, and they have different methods for dealing with spatial representativeness, missing data, changes in temperature, measuring instrumentation, adjusting for the time of day, all sorts of different adjustments that they make. And the adjustments, as you can see, are rather huge. Okay, so should we, to me, the error bars should really be much bigger if they're making such a large adjustment. So we really don't know too much about what's going on in terms of, it's a great deal of uncertainty. Yes, I do believe that we've overall been warming, but we've been warming for 200, maybe even 400 years. Okay, and that's not caused by humans. Okay, there's natural variability involved. And this is exactly what has not been sorted out. Now, the ocean temperature is the current focus of controversy. I mean, the land data sets are sort of starting to agree, but there's a great deal of controversy and uncertainty right now in the treatment of the ocean temperatures. And that has not been sorted out. And so especially looking, in the recent period, if we're trying to sort out what's going on with the hiatus or the pause, we need to look at the satellite data. I mean, this is the best data that we have, and it's global. And we need to sort out the differences between the satellite and the surface observations. And then there's the numerical weather prediction, reanalysis, data assimilation systems that give us a global view. And we haven't been really using that for climate purposes, and I think we need to. So the work is just starting in terms of trying to sort this out.
Now,
and
Dr. Curry, you said something very important there, and that you said the satellite data are the best data we have. Can you explain as a scientist why that's the case?
Well, it's global coverage. It's not a simple measurement. You have to do, a retrieval and weighting functions, and it's a complex problem. But it's reasonably well calibrated and consistent over the last 30-ish years.
And not a single Democratic senator had any response to the satellite data that demonstrates their entire theory of global warming for 18 years hasn't been happening.
Yeah, I mean, we need to sort this out rather than ignore it. I mean, this is what I'm concerned about.
And Mr. Stein, you look like you want to make a comment.
Yeah,
I want to ask a question on this because you also are quite familiar with the cooking of the books of the hockey stick, and indeed, Dr. Curry, you mentioned ClimateGate and the scientists receiving a whole lot of funding to conclude global warming was occurring and then adjusting their results to reflect that. I would note if you systematically adjust the numbers upwards for more recent temperatures, wouldn't that by definition produce a data set that proves your global warming theory is correct? And the more you add, the more warming you can find, and you don't have to actually bother looking at what the thermometer says. You just add whatever number you want.
No, that's what's fascinating about this. Could you just tell me the left-hand date on your chart, Senator? What is it? I can't quite see it from here.
On the left?
On the right-hand chart of the blue and red line, what's the...
In both of them, it's 1900, isn't it?
1900. So you look at the blue line, you look at the red line. This is the adjustment of figures that is going on now.
Yeah.
What has happened since the global warming pause is that the public does not trust the alarmist establishment to tell them what the climate will be like in the year 2050. What that chart shows is why the public is moving to a new position now where it doesn't even trust these federal agencies to tell them what the climate was like in 1950 or 1920 or 1900. And that's interesting. If these adjustments are merited, if an adjustment in the official recorded observed temperature, because Gavin Schmidt at NASA wasn't standing out by the thermometer in the year 1920, but he suddenly decides a century on, what are we now, well, 95 years on, that 1920's temperature needs adjusting. That tells you how uncertain the science is. I would also like, Senator, just to say a word about this whole national security thing, because I've never heard anything quite so ridiculous. We are a country in which we have an enemy overseas who so-called radicalizes suburban couples in California who go out and kill people, but we are planning now for global security threats a century hence, because the Maldives might have been swept away by water by then. The entire population of the Maldives are all Sunni Muslim, so they'll fit in perfectly fine if they all move to this Brussels suburb that produced the shooters in Paris. But climate change is irrelevant to the long-term patterns. And I cannot tell you how absurd it is to be talking about climate change as a security threat compared to, say, just to pluck at random, population. In 1920, the British Isles and British West Africa had the same population, about 45 million people, for England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales on the one hand, and what are now Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the Gambia on the other hand. Now, the British Isles has a combined population, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, about 69 million, and British West Africa has a population of 250 million. So the security threat is exactly what we see in Europe at the moment, that Niger, a country that has increased its population by 50% in this century, since the year 2000, and had millions of starving people already that it couldn't feed, and is expected to increase its population tenfold by the end of the century, and all those people are just going to get on a boat and walk into Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal. And the idea that somehow climate change's impact on that is absolutely trivial to the remorselessness of those numbers. And I understand that governments find it easier to deal with cloud cuckoo, fantasy land, saving the planet type issues. But this is a complete waste of time for an already beleaguered Defense Department having difficulty fighting the wars it's actually in right now in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, suddenly dealing with sea levels in the Maldives in the 22nd century. It's completely preposterous and a complete waste of time.
So I'll leave that aside for a moment. and simply observe, if we look to the satellite data, we see for 18 years no significant recorded warming. We see no response from the Democratic senators. If we look to the raw data, according to the raw data in 1940, it appears from this chart, the 5-year mean temperature was higher than it is in recent time. But once you adjust it, if you subtract from the old temperatures and add to the new ones, then you can have measurements that reflect your theory. Dr. Happer, you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one more thing about the satellite data, and that is that they are cross-calibrated with weather balloons all over the world. And so it's not simply a couple of groups measuring satellites. There's a quality check that goes on there, and there's no similar thing to the surface data that I know of.
It's a very good point, and indeed, Dr. Christie's chart, as he described, was an average of several measurements of both the satellites and the weather balloon. If we can move to the next two charts, I want to, the final line of questioning I want to address is the effect of censorship, of dogmatism, of intimidation. So both of these come from BarackObama.com, a website I will admit I don't spend a lot of time perusing. On BarackObama.com, the President of the United States is issuing a call out the climate deniers. Too many of our elected officials deny the science of climate change. Along with their polluter allies, they are blocking progress in the fight against climate change. Find the deniers near you. Find the heretics and call them out today. And indeed, they show a number. And I will say, when I first looked at that chart, I was quite disappointed. I thought I was omitted, but then I discovered I am indeed included, along with a number of other elected officials. Indeed, I might note a number of elected officials. What does it do to scientific debate when anyone who dares question political ideology is branded a denier and a heretic? What are the consequences in the academic world when that occurs? Dr. Curry.
There's a chilling effect, okay? People keep their heads down. They look for opportunities just to do something else and to move on, retire, get out of the business. I've talked to any number of scientists who have done this, recent PhD recipients on up to very senior scientists. It has a very chilling effect. As a tenured scientist who's relatively senior, I felt sufficiently secure to speak out. But younger scientists who are not tenured, fear for their jobs. They have mortgage payments, whatever, and and kids to support. They can't afford to speak out. The social contract currently between the Obama administration and climate scientists is if you say alarming things, you'll get plenty of funding. That seems to be how it's working. And that is very, very pernicious for science.
And do you get funded if you're researching anything other than the orthodoxy of global warming alarmism?
I'm no longer applying for government grants. I can't get funded to do anything I want.
Let me speak more in the aggregate. Does one get funded if one is a scientist and one, I recall being back in high school and studying science, the scientific method, that you started with an hypothesis and then you look to evidence to prove or disprove the hypothesis, and often disproving it is the more useful thing to try to do. Do those who are actually trying to disprove the hypotheses, mind you, the hypotheses that will drive up the electric bills and the cost of living for millions of Americans, will hurt people who are struggling, will hurt single moms, will hurt Hispanics, will hurt African Americans, does anyone doing any research that might contradict the political dogma, are they at all likely to get funding?
Okay, the issue is this. The funding agencies do a call for proposals or an announcement of opportunity, and they're already implicitly assuming that human-caused climate change is dangerous. There's not even an opportunity or something that even makes sense to write, to submit a proposal to. Right. So that's the real problem. So a lot of the skeptical research is really being conducted by independent scientists who are not asking for any government funding.
Okay, so my final two questions. One of the letters that the minority has submitted into the record is a letter from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. A sentence within that letter: we are committed to the principle that scientific inquiry and open scientific communication, regardless of field of study, should proceed unhampered by intrusions on academic freedom. Now, that is a noble-sounding statement and one that with which I agree emphatically. I want to ask the members of the panel, how does that noble sentiment comport with the call from our colleague, Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, that anyone who dares dispute the global warming alarmist orthodoxy should face criminal prosecution under RICO? Are those two statements somehow compatible, that you can have academic freedom and robust debate when you've got politicians saying we will criminally prosecute you as a racketeer if you dispute our political orthodoxy?
Well, that statement by Science the AAAS is really a myth, because about 2 months ago, well, maybe 3 months ago, the editor of Science, Marcia McNutt, had an op-ed in Science that said, "The debate is over. Urgent action needed," essentially. And this was the editor of Science, which is the flagship journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. When an editor of a scientific journal makes a statement like that, it gives all of the editors a license to completely ignore any publication that's submitted that questions a consensus. And this is the real pernicious thing that's going on. So right now, we're more ruled by the RICO mentality than we are by those lofty sentiments expressed by the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Senator, you said your parents were, I think, mathematicians, statistical modelers. We've had a lot of talk today about climate science. I compiled a book that you were kind enough to mention the title of, and what was fascinating me about that book was that climate science evolves. 20 years ago, it was basically a branch of, 30 years ago, physical geography. Now it's basically computer modeling. Yet at the same time, the majority of statisticians who look at the climate models think they are grossly unprofessional. Mathematicians and statisticians who look at the way these climate models and the way the hockey stick were constructed are not on board with it at all. A majority of engineers are not on board with it. A majority of physicists, non-climate physicists, are not on board with this. So this idea that climate science is this hermetically sealed specialty that is sealed off from the rest of the world is nonsense. Climate science, you have dendrochronology types, you have statistical modeling types, and there are elements of all in the work that they do. But certain people, mathematicians, engineers, statisticians, are not on board with this. And Judith mentioned Science magazine. Nature magazine went even further. They're the two most prestigious science journals on the planet, Nature and Science. And Nature printed a statement recently from a group of climate scientists who said, quote, "Climate justice," unquote, "climate justice is more important than democracy." So that the fake 97% consensus is no longer enough. The fake 97% consensus of so-called climate scientists now has to trump the 51% of the electorate. No science in history has conducted itself like this, and it would be unrecognizable to Sir Isaac Newton or Charles Babbage or the Curies to see a self-sustaining, malign politico-science nexus supporting itself and excluding all other voices. It is at odds with scientific inquiry across the centuries.
In 2009, August 31st, 2009, then Senator John Kerry, as I discussed in my opening, said scientists project that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer of 2013, not in 2050, but 4 years from now. The nice thing about this is, unlike theories that can't necessarily be disproven, this is actually a statement that can be tested by actual facts and evidence. Dr. Happer, was it in fact accurate in the summer of 2013 the Arctic was ice-free?
No, it certainly wasn't ice-free, but if I could follow up on something my colleague just said, actually, this is not unprecedented in climate science. If you look in the Soviet Union for 30 years, it was reigned by Lysenko in biology. and he had a complete control over biology. You got fired or worse if you didn't agree with his brand of biology. And that was finally brought to an end, partly because of people from other fields. For example, Andrei Sakharov, the inventor of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, led some of the opposition because he had enough stature to stand up and push back. But most people were afraid. So there was a state of fear that was actually quite a bit worse than climate right now. But nevertheless, it's a good lesson to remember.
And my final question, Dr. Titley, based on your 3 decades serving in the Navy, do you agree with President Obama, who said holding a global warming summit in Europe was a powerful rebuke to the ISIS terrorist who just committed a horrific act of terrorism in Paris and indeed likewise in San Bernardino?
Senator, thanks, sir, for the question. The way I describe these geostrategic risks of climate change, climate is the risk, and it makes the threats such as ISIS worse. So this is not an either or. It's not a false dichotomy.
But I'm asking your judgment as a military man if you agree with President Obama that holding a global warming summit was a powerful rebuke to the ISIS terrorist. I find that statement absurd on its face. I'm asking based on your military judgment, do you agree with the President?
We have to address both, sir. Thank you.
From your declining to answer, I take it the inference of that is that your answer is no.
My answer is, sir, we have to address both the risk of climate change and the threat of ISIS. Thank you. Senator Peters.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go first with your permission. And Mr. Chairman, I might say, just supporting the Admiral, sea level rise is a threat to an area such as Bangladesh. It will cause a huge displacement of population, which will cause turmoil, which is the conditions that are ripe for extremists to exploit. So there are answers to that. And I would just conclude my remarks by saying, you know, we've been talking about censorship here. Mr. Chairman, you are my friend. And as you know, I am respectful to you and the other senators. I find it somewhat ironic that we're talking about censorship against those that speak against climate change, when in fact it's been exactly the opposite over and over. And it was so much so that we saw examples where various levels of government said that you couldn't even use the term climate change, that I offered an amendment in March in front of the full Senate. A majority voted for my amendment, including 2 Republican members of this committee, Senator Rubio and Senator Ayotte. And so when we start talking about muzzling of scientists, I think we better watch out how we're talking about which side is trying to do the muzzling, because that amendment to prevent muzzling of scientists on the subject of climate change, it actually had a majority, and it was a bipartisan majority that voted for it in the Senate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly have enjoyed the hearing and the testimony, but actually to pick up on comments by Senator Nelson about muzzling, certainly that didn't occur in this hearing. We heard from 3 witnesses, scientific witnesses, as well as the political commentator about issues related to climate change that represented a particular point of view that is not shared by the the vast majority of the scientific community has been very clearly demonstrated in numerous documented studies. The 97% figure, for example, that has been documented by a number of studies. So I was curious. We had 3 folks testifying with concerns about the science, and if you look at it in a ratio of 97 folks, we had 3 scientists who had some questions, who represent not 60% of the scientific consensus. We had Mr. Stein with a political commentator, which I know if you add all the political commentators on both sides of the issue, it'd be a lot more than 1 out of 5, I'm sure. It'd probably fill several rooms here. Dr. Tilley, you were here by yourself, but if we put it in perspective, we had the 3 that took this perspective, and I think there's probably, I don't know if there's 100 people in this room, but probably everybody else in this room would have a different position. Certainly as policymakers, this is about leadership. It's about making decisions, about someone who has to make decisions that are going to impact the country. Dr. Tilley, we talked about military commanders that have to make decisions based on intelligence reports and best estimates of the risk involved and then weigh that against the potential consequences. That's exactly what we have to do here in this committee. It's what we have to do as U.S. senators, is that we have to listen to experts. I'm not a climatologist. I rely on climatologists to give me information and then make policy decisions based on that. And oftentimes it is about weighing the opinions of folks. And in this case, the scales of justice or of weighing are clearly on a side different than what we've heard from 4 of the 5 witnesses. So today you had that opportunity to present that view in a very unbalanced way. It would have been great if we could have had 100 scientists and had 97 telling us one thing and the 3 of you something else. That's not what we have, but I think it's important to keep that image in mind. And if we're going to be serious policymakers that are going to make decisions that are going to impact this country and are going to impact the world, we have to make decisions based on expertise from those who understand this science better than anyone. And that's where I come. I try to come from a dispassionate side, that let's listen to the science, let's listen to folks who are experts. And that's why, I'm disappointed that we didn't have a more balanced hearing, but I certainly appreciate your testimony, Dr. Tilley. And I'd like to just ask you a few questions related to that, because we heard quite a bit about satellite data, and Chairman Cruz had a line of questioning related to that. And I'm concerned that, from listening to that, people might think that satellites are just basically thermometers in space running around. We know that that's not the case. And in fact, I'd like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, this report. It's a 2006 synthesis and assessment report of the U.S. Climate Change Science Program, and it really underscores the difficulty in using satellite data, in that it's a complex numerical model that converts satellite observations in order to determine temperature. If we could put that in, I'd appreciate it.
Without objection, it'll be entered in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And given that thought, Admiral Tilley, if you could explain briefly expand on that, how satellites is a complex mechanism in order to do that, as well as if you could briefly explain the corrections that have been made over time to UH satellite data sets since the original estimates were published. These data sets are revised on a regular basis because of the difficulty in correlating. Is that correct?
Senator, thank you. Thank you, sir. I mean, kind of the bottom line, it's not rocket science. It's actually harder. Once you get the satellite up in the air, then you have to do something with the data. And as is being talked about, I think, several times in this committee, they are not thermometers in space. There's all different types of frequencies, all the way from visible, the pictures that you see on the TV, infrared, and there's also some things called micrometer. So it's basically almost like radar. It's not exactly, but some of them are. And what you do is you're trying to look down through the atmosphere. But of course, the atmosphere doesn't say, oh, here's a low part, and then there's a nice dividing, and here's the middle. So you have different frequencies that are mostly sensitive, but not entirely sensitive to those different parts. And then you have to put all of that stuff together. And it's complicated. A lot of work in meteorology was done in this, and it was one of the real big advances when we figured out how to use these data directly and not make them like thermometers. That happened around the year 2000 or so, and it was a big advance. As you mentioned, sir, there have been just a number of corrections that have had to be made to the UAH data set, merging overlapping satellite records. So when you have satellite A and satellite B, how do you in fact cross-calibrate? How do you compare them? As the satellites go around and around, they actually start falling back to Earth. Very slightly, but they fall back to Earth. You have to account for that orbital decay. You have to account for the stratosphere, the air up above what we've been talking about, this where we live or near where we live, and is that contaminated? And then there's even things like the diurnal heating corrections. So like when the satellite is in where the sun, you have to account for that. And those have, it has taken other people such as Mears and Wentz from remote sensing systems and other external scientists to help with those data sets to get them corrected. And again, it's not easy stuff to do. It's hard stuff to do, but there have been a number of errors.
So I get from that testimony that satellite data alone may be inadequate. We need to look at a variety of other measurements of climate indicators. So how do climate models compare with these measurements and observations in the aggregate when we're looking at a variety of tools to measure what's happening on our planet?
There's a saying, certainly in the weather community and other communities as well, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And in a technical sense, it's really hard to find a weather or a climate model that is exactly right all the time. But they can tell you very useful things. So even back in 1979, Jim Hansen of NASA published in Nature, it was published, I think, in May of 1980, his climate model. This is from 35 years ago when probably his computer system was not even as powerful as our iPhones today. And what that showed, in published record, anybody can look it up, is the temperature was going to start going up. And then when you overlay the actual temperatures on there, he was wrong. But he was wrong because it was actually slightly too cold. But it was very useful because it said, guys, we're going to get on this escalator and we're going to start going up. So the climate models are useful. They are certainly getting better. Are they perfect? No. Could we use more research and development, better computers? Yes. Could we use better observations? Yes. But they are very useful, and they do help us understand the future. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lee. Another question here. We've heard about or had testimony that folks sometimes have difficulty getting their positions heard. If you could explain to us the importance of skepticism in the scientific process, that is indeed very important, and specifically how the peer review process works, which leads to these academic journals and studies.
I mean, skepticism is what drives science. Mm-hmm. I mean, very frankly, it's what drives science. It's people who ask different questions in different ways. They either get inspired, they come up with a new data set, they see a way to use a new data set, and that can sometimes challenge the very orthodoxy. I mean, you look at Darwin and challenge the very orthodoxy. As far as the peer review doesn't mean that this is the final settled science, but it does mean there's a logical flow. It means that the scientist or the author has, in fact, correctly taken a look at his or her field previously and documented that. The methods are clear, and the conclusions are consistent with the evidence that was presented. It may not be the final word, but it's sort of that good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will, so that if you're reading from another field or if you're a policymaker, if you understand it's peer-reviewed, there's some sort of certification or quality control. It may not be perfect, but over time, it's a pretty good process.
So these papers aren't based on dogma. It's a very robust scientific process that has significant review by peers who have expertise in the area.
Senator, in my opinion, the vast majority of papers are based on data and not dogma.
How, Dr. or Admiral Titley as well, what do we understand about the natural phenomena that has contributed to warming from the last 150 years versus effect of carbon that humans have released? We've heard that from some of our other panelists, that there's other natural phenomena. Could you kind of dive into that a little more and give us a better sense of what we know about humans' impact?
Yes, sir. The human's impact is really primarily, although not exclusively, from greenhouse gases. Land use also has an impact. Agriculture has an impact. But primarily, it's our energy uses, fossil fuels. And what they are doing is putting billions of tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So even though in absolute terms 400 parts per million doesn't sound like that much, compared to where we started the pre-industrial revolution at about 275, 280 parts per million, it's a significant increase. And we are seeing those effects. We are seeing the temperatures come up, but we're also seeing the rainfall come up. A warmer atmosphere has the potential to hold, if you will, more water vapor. So when it rains, it can rain harder. The temperatures are melting the ice. We've already talked about, I believe with Senator Schatz, the sea level expansion, or the thermal expansion. So we're seeing all these different independent lines of evidence. And since we built human civilization based on climate stability, that's the challenge that we have. We now have to adapt. And I think I've heard some of the other panelists say we need to adapt. So we're going to have to adapt to the climate changes that are coming that we cannot stop. But at the same time, we need to figure out how not to drive over the cliff, how to change ourselves so that all we have is a bumpy ride, put your seatbelts on, and we'll be okay. But if we don't get serious with this, we could have a very, very rough ride indeed.
Well, hopefully that's where we'll spend time in this committee in the future, is thinking through how do we adapt, how do we design policy prescriptions to what is a complex but potentially dangerous change in the climate. I want to go back, because I didn't hear the other response. I think Dr. Harper talked about carbon dioxide, and I just want to have opportunity for you to respond, Dr. Tilley. Is that we know that there have been periods in Earth's history prior to the evolution of photosynthesis, I believe, when carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were much higher than they are now. Can you talk about what the Earth was like in times past when carbon dioxide levels were much higher, and what that might mean for us now? And you heard Dr. Harper's testimony. Perhaps your response would be helpful now.
Yes, sir. There certainly have been times in the past where carbon dioxide levels have been much, much higher. But there weren't modern humans, and there certainly weren't billions of humans. So our challenge is, how do we deal with these new rises in carbon dioxide with 7, 8 billion people on board? The plants, certainly, in general, plants do better, but so do the weeds. So if you're looking at agriculture, what you have to deal with is not only are the plants that you want to grow are going to do better, the weeds are going to grow better, but they're going to do so in a hotter environment. Do you start crossing thresholds, either not only daytime thresholds, nighttime thresholds? Does it mess up with the germination? Does it mess up with the pollination? Where are you going to get the water from if you've changed the basic water cycle? So all of those issues become a great challenge, and you need to be able to look at the entire system of agriculture in a changing climate to see where the risks are and where the challenges are.
Well, I think those are important points, Dr. Tilley, and I'd actually like to enter in the record 2 studies, one in 2006 by Stephen Long and another study here by Samuel Myers that also has a little different perspective on CO2 levels than what we heard in testimony today. If I could introduce that in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, that we made part of the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And then I've also we've had some references by members of the panel regarding Senator Whitehouse and some comments that he had made. I would like to enter into the record as well a speech that he made that should be entered into the record as to refute some of the comments that were made by the panel.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Peters. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here. Actually, Dr. Happer, you wanted to brief.
I just wanted to make one response about satellite temperature measurements. They measure temperature the same way as hospitals do today. Nobody sticks a thermometer in your mouth anymore. They use a temporal scanner, or they put something in your ear. And so they're measuring radiation in exactly the same way that satellites do, except infrared radiation. So everybody uses the same temperature measurements today.
Thank you, Dr. Happer. That's helpful. This hearing was a hearing to discuss facts and evidence and data rather than partisan dogma and ideology. And there are at least 7 facts that our witnesses have laid out here to which there have been, I believe, no effective response. Number 1, that carbon dioxide, rather than being a pollutant, is good for plant life. Number 2, that the Earth, right now today, is greening. Number 3, that for significant periods in history, there has been markedly more CO2 in our atmosphere, and that was prior to the Industrial Revolution, so it could not have come from the burning of fossil fuels. Number 4, that for the last 18 years, the satellite data and the weather balloon data both demonstrate no significant warming whatsoever. That fact in particular, not a single Democratic senator had an effective response to. Number 5, that the satellite data and the weather balloon data are the best evidence we have of whether warming is occurring, and that evidence, the actual data, demonstrate that it is not. Number 6, that the seas were rising more in the first half of the 20th century, prior to the significant increase in carbon dioxide emissions, than they are now. And number 8, that the computer models, the apocalyptic computer models that are telling us we need to raise every hardworking American's electric bills, gas bills, cost of living. We need to make it harder for single moms, for immigrants, for African Americans, for Hispanics, for hardworking men and women. We need to make it harder for them to make a living and make ends meet. The computer models are profoundly wrong. Not a little bit wrong, but profoundly inconsistent with the data and the evidence. None of these 8 facts tend to make it through the media gatekeepers that instead enforce, like the Inquisition, a discipline on the heretics that would dare stand in the way of their political ideology of imposing trillions of dollars of cost on people who are struggling. Policy should be driven by facts, and as John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. In addition to the number of things entered in the record, I've got a series of newspaper articles describing the persecution of so-called climate deniers that without objection are going to be entered into the record. I'm also going to enter into the record the op-ed that Senator Whitehouse wrote calling for RICO criminal prosecution of anyone who dares stand in the way of the political ideology that hurts working men and women. The hearing record is going to remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record, and upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I want to thank you for the time in preparing your testimony. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.